Before there were 50 states, there was no map. Before there were borders, there were people, millions of them living on land that had never been divided. We call them Indigenous or Native American, but back then, they simply called themselves by their own names: the Haudenosaunee, the Lakota, the Muskogee, the Pueblo. Each nation had its own language, its own government, its own sense of where home began and ended. And here's the thing, this wasn't empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. This was a world already full of roads, trade networks, cities, and laws. At its height, around 1050 AD, a city called Cahokia stood near what is now St. Louis, Missouri. It was bigger than London at the time. Tens of thousands of people lived there, built massive earthen mounds, and traded goods from as far away as the Gulf Coast. Then, for reasons historians still argue about, it was abandoned. But that's just one story, in one place, out of hundreds. Across the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans carved entire cities into cliffsides. In the Pacific Northwest, nations like the Chinook built sophisticated economies around salmon and cedar. Along the Atlantic coast, the Powhatan Confederacy controlled a vast network of villages stretching hundreds of miles. These weren't scattered tribes living in isolation. They were connected, political, and deeply tied to specific pieces of land. Now, when European explorers arrived, they didn't see it that way. In 1492, Columbus landed in what is now the Caribbean, and within years a chain reaction had begun. The Spanish pushed north into what would become Florida, New Mexico, Texas. The French moved down from Canada into the Mississippi Valley. The English planted their first permanent settlement at Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. Each of these powers drew lines on maps, not because the land was empty, but because drawing lines was how they claimed it. And the people already living there, they were not consulted. Here's what gets lost in most history textbooks. The land that would become the United States was not one thing. It was dozens of overlapping worlds, each with deep roots, long memories, and a fierce sense of place. The Haudenosaunee, what the French called the Iroquois, had a democratic system of governance so sophisticated that some historians believe it influenced the founding fathers themselves. Their great law of peace, passed down orally for centuries, outlined a union of nations, with checks on power and protection for individual rights. Sound familiar? By the time the first English colonies were firmly established, the continent's original map had already been shifting for decades. Diseases brought by Europeans, smallpox, measles, had swept through indigenous communities with devastating speed. Some estimates suggest that by 1600, up to 90% of some indigenous populations had already died from disease alone. Entire nations that the first colonists never even met had already been wiped out. So when settlers wrote in their journals about vast, open, empty land, it wasn't always wilderness they were seeing. In many cases, it was the aftermath of catastrophe. This is the ground beneath the ground, the history that existed before the history most people learn. Every single state in America sits on top of it. Every state line drawn on a map cuts through land that someone called home long before that line existed. The borders you see today were not inevitable. They were fought over, negotiated, stolen, purchased, and sometimes drawn by men who had never even set foot in the places they were dividing. That's the secret hiding in plain sight at the center of every state's story. And when you understand what came before the lines themselves start to look very different. But the first people to draw a line and spark a conflict that would reshape the entire eastern half of the continent weren't the founding fathers. They were French soldiers deep in the wilderness, hammering iron plates into the ground to mark land that wasn't theirs. The year was 1493, and a single man in Rome was about to decide who owned an entire hemisphere. His name was Rodrigo Borgia, one of the most corrupt popes in history, and he had just been handed a problem. Spain and Portugal were both racing to claim the New World, and they were about to go to war over it. So the Pope did something that would shape American history forever. He drew a line. With a single stroke of a quill, he split the entire world in half. Everything west of that line belonged to Spain. Everything east belonged to Portugal. Just like that. 2 kings, 2 crowns, 1 stroke of ink. No one asked the people who already lived there. This was the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494, and it was the first time Europe carved up America on paper. Now here's where it gets complicated. Spain's slice of the deal was enormous. Nearly all of North America, Central America, and South America. For over a century, Spain sent explorers north, men like Hernando de Soto, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, pushing deep into what is now the American South and Southwest. De Soto waded through the swamps of Florida in 1539 with 600 men, looking for gold. He found no gold, but he became the first European to see the Mississippi River. Coronado rode into present-day Kansas in 1541, convinced he would find cities of gold. Instead, he found grasslands stretching to the edge of the sky. Spain claimed it all anyway, and that claim, planted in the dirt of what would become Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, is why those states exist where they do today. But Spain was not the only kingdom with ambitions. France had been watching. In 1524, a French-backed explorer named Giovanni da Verrazzano sailed the entire east coast of North America. He mapped it, claimed it, and called it New France. Then Samuel de Champlain pushed even deeper, into the Great Lakes, down the St. Lawrence River, through forests no European had ever seen. France planted its flag across what would become Canada, Louisiana, and a diagonal strip of land cutting right through the heart of America. You can still feel it today, in the name Louisiana, in the streets of New Orleans, in the Cajun accents of the bayou. Meanwhile, England arrived late, and almost failed completely. Their first serious attempt at a permanent colony was Roanoke Island in 1587. 115 settlers landed on a thin strip of land off what is now North Carolina. Their governor, John White, sailed back to England for supplies. When he finally returned 3 years later, delayed by war, every single colonist had vanished. No bodies, no blood, no sign of struggle. Just one word carved into a wooden post: Croatoan. To this day, historians still argue about what happened to them. But England did not stop. In 1607, they planted a permanent stake in the ground at Jamestown, Virginia, and this time, they stayed. It was brutal, swampy, disease-ridden, and nearly wiped out in its first winter, but it survived. And from that single muddy outpost, England would eventually claim the entire eastern seaboard. So by the early 1700s, you had three great empires, Spain, France, England, all pressing against each other on the same continent. Each one had drawn its own version of the map. Each one believed it owned land the others also claimed. And every single one of those overlapping, contradicting, furiously contested lines would eventually become a border between American states. The map of America was not born from logic or geography. It was born from competition, greed, and the ambitions of kings who had never once set foot on American soil. But when those empires finally collided, the bloodshed would redraw everything. Before the ink dried on any European map, this land already had owners, and those owners had been here for 10,000 years. The Cherokee, the Iroquois, the Lakota, they didn't just live on the land, they were the land. Every river had a name before English explorers ever saw it. Every mountain trail was already worn down by generations of feet. But here's where the story gets dark. The moment European powers started drawing borders, a collision was coming, and it would last for over 300 years. The first major promise was made in 1763. After Britain crushed France in the 7 Years' War, King George III signed the Royal Proclamation. It was supposed to protect native lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. Colonists were forbidden from settling beyond that line. For a moment, it looked like a real boundary, a real promise. But promises, it turned out, were only as strong as the men enforcing them, and nobody was enforcing anything. Within years, settlers were pouring past that line like it didn't exist, because to them, it didn't. Then came the Revolution, and everything reset. The new United States needed land to pay its war debts, and there was only one place to get it. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 opened up the land north of the Ohio River for settlement. What the law didn't mention was the hundreds of thousands of people already living there. The Miami, the Shawnee, the Delaware, they watched the surveyors arrive, and they knew exactly what those surveying chains meant. War followed almost immediately. In 1794, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in what is now Ohio, U.S. forces crushed a native confederacy. The Treaty of Greenville the following year stripped 12 native nations of most of their land. 12 nations, one treaty, gone. But the worst was still coming. Andrew Jackson became president in 1829, and he had a plan. He called it Indian removal. Congress passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830. It gave the government the power to force native tribes east of the Mississippi to relocate west of it. The Cherokee tried to fight it, legally. They hired lawyers, they went to the Supreme Court, and they won. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that the U.S. government had no authority to remove them. Andrew Jackson looked at that ruling and reportedly said, "He has made his decision, now let him enforce it." He just ignored the Supreme Court, and no one stopped him. What followed is known as the Trail of Tears. In the brutal winter of 1838, U.S. soldiers forced roughly 16,000 Cherokee people from their homes in Georgia. They marched them over 800 miles to present-day Oklahoma. Around 4,000 people died on that march. Children, elders, whole families frozen in the mud. And the Cherokee were not alone. The Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, all forced west. The Seminole refused, and Florida turned into a 7-year war. It cost the U.S. more money than almost any conflict since the Revolution, and still the government pushed. Every single state east of the Mississippi has this history buried in its soil. The names on the map are often all that's left. Ohio, Illinois, Mississippi, all native words for land that was taken. The treaties kept coming, and they kept breaking. By the time the Civil War began, government had signed over 370 treaties with native nations. It had broken every single one. Every single one. And west of the Mississippi, the story was only getting started. The year was 1776, and the world had never seen anything like it. 13 colonies, stretched along the Atlantic coast, decided they were done being told what to do. Not by a king, not by a parliament 3,000 miles away. They were going to govern themselves. And to do that, they were willing to bleed for it. The man who put the words to that dream was Thomas Jefferson. He was 33 years old, sitting in a rented room in Philadelphia, in the summer of 1776. He wrote it in 17 days. We hold these truths to be self-evident. 4 words that cracked history in half. But here's the crazy part. Nobody knew if it would work. Washington's army was outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of boots. At Valley Forge in the winter of 1777, men literally left bloody footprints in the snow. 2,000 soldiers died there, not in battle, but from cold and hunger. Washington himself wrote that he wasn't sure they could survive the winter. But they did, and that survival changed everything that came after. The war turned for real at Yorktown, Virginia, in October 1781. General Cornwallis, the most powerful British commander in America, surrendered. He didn't even show up in person. He claimed he was sick. His men handed over their swords while a British band played a song called "The World Turned Upside Down." That title wasn't wrong, because when the revolution ended, it didn't just free 13 states. It handed the new nation a continent it had no idea what to do with. The Treaty of Paris gave America everything east of the Mississippi River. All of it. Forests, rivers, mountain ranges, and land that indigenous nations had lived on for thousands of years. Those nations hadn't signed anything. They hadn't surrendered. And they weren't going anywhere without a fight. So the new United States had won its independence from one empire, and immediately started building another one of its own. State by state, the country began pushing west. Virginia gave up its western land claims in 1784, creating the territory that would become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. North Carolina ceded what would become Tennessee. Georgia held on to its western land the longest, and made a deal so corrupt, it became a national scandal. In 1795, Georgia legislators sold 35 million acres of land they didn't fully own, to private speculators for half a cent an acre. The bribes were so obvious that almost every single legislator who voted yes received shares in the deal. When the public found out, the new legislature burned the official record of the vote. In the fireplace of the state capitol, they used a magnifying glass to focus sunlight on it, because they said fire from heaven was the only pure enough flame to erase it. That is the kind of country this was becoming. A country where the rules were still being written, and sometimes burned. By 1800, the United States had 16 states and a population of 5 million people. But the land beyond the Mississippi was still a mystery, still unmapped, still wild, still controlled by Spain, and quietly being watched by Napoleon Bonaparte. And the deal that was about to be made over that land would be the biggest real estate transaction in the history of the world. The revolution had redrawn the map, but drawing lines on paper and actually controlling the land were two very different things. 13 states existed on paper, but beyond the Appalachian Mountains, the ground belonged to nobody and everybody, all at once. Native nations still held the forests, French traders still moved along the rivers, and thousands of American settlers were already pushing west without asking anyone's permission. Here's where it gets complicated. The new American government was almost broke. They had fought a war on borrowed money, and now the bills were coming due. The one thing they did have, land, millions of acres of wilderness stretching north and west of the Ohio River. So in 1787, Congress passed a document called the Northwest Ordinance. It was quiet, it was technical, it was boring, and it changed America forever. The ordinance said, once a territory reached 60,000 free settlers, it could apply to become a state, not a colony, not a territory forever, a state, equal to every other state already in the Union. That one rule created a machine that would grind for the next 175 years, pulling territory after territory into the American fold. But the machine was never clean. Ohio came first in 1803, the 16th star on the flag. It sounds simple until you know what happened to get there. The land Ohio now sits on was home to the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Miami, nations who had lived there for centuries. They did not vote on the Northwest Ordinance. They were not consulted when 60,000 settlers crossed into their forests and called it progress. General Anthony Wayne, a man so reckless his own soldiers called him Mad Anthony, led U.S. forces against a confederation of tribes at a place called Fallen Timbers in 1794. One battle, 90 minutes, and after it, the Treaty of Greenville forced native nations to surrender most of what is now Ohio. Statehood was built on that ground. This was the pattern, not just for Ohio, but for nearly every state that followed. A territory wanted statehood, the federal government wanted settlers, tax revenue, political power, and whoever was living on that land before the settlers arrived, they became an obstacle to be removed, sometimes by treaty, sometimes by war, sometimes by starvation. By the time the Civil War broke out, 33 states existed. And here is a secret most Americans never learned in school. Several of those states came into the Union specifically because of slavery, not despite it, but because of it. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was the first time Congress had to admit the truth out loud. Every new state threatened to tip the balance. Missouri wanted in as a slave state. The North refused to let that happen without a free state to match it. Maine entered as free, Missouri entered as slave. The country had started splitting itself in two, one admission at a time. And it only got worse. Texas joined the Union in 1845, the first republic ever voluntarily annexed into the United States. Sam Houston, the man who had crushed Santa Anna at San Jacinto, stood in the Texas Senate chamber and wept when he heard that Texas had voted to secede 16 years later. He had fought to join America. He would not fight to leave it. He was removed from office. Statehood, it turns out, was never just a ceremony. It was a negotiation, a transaction, a power play dressed up in flags and speeches. 37 states by 1867, 45 by 1896, 48 by 1912. Each one a story of someone who wanted in and someone who paid the price for it. And then there were two territories that waited longer than anyone else. Territories that had been promised statehood for decades, only to be told again and again, not yet. Their story is the strangest of all, and it starts with a purchase that most of Congress thought was the dumbest idea in American history. Every state entered the Union with a handshake and a promise, but some of them were hiding something in the fine print. When delegates sat down to draft their state constitutions, they faced a choice. They could write what they truly believed, or they could write what they needed to believe. And more often than not, they chose the latter. Take Georgia, 1788. The men who signed that constitution owned between them thousands of enslaved people. They wrote soaring words about liberty and the rights of man, and then they quietly embedded protections for slavery so deep in the document that removing them would take a war. not a metaphor. An actual war. Mississippi's 1717 Constitution did the same, and went further. It explicitly barred the legislature from ever emancipating enslaved people without the consent of their owners. The owners had to agree to free the people they owned. Let that sink in for a moment. The so-called founding law of the state made freedom nearly impossible by design, and nobody in Washington objected loudly enough to stop it. Here's where it gets darker. Some states buried sins that had nothing to do with slavery at all. In 1819, Alabama entered the Union with a constitution that looked almost modern. It had a Bill of Rights. It had separation of powers. It even had protections for jury trials. But buried in Article 6 was a clause that stripped voting rights from any man convicted of certain crimes. Crimes that were, not coincidentally, prosecuted almost exclusively against poor white men and free black men. The ink wasn't even dry before the system started working exactly as intended. Connecticut is another story people don't tell at dinner parties. Connecticut was one of the original 13 colonies. Old money, old families, old power. And when they finally ratified a proper state constitution in 1818, nearly 50 years after independence, one reason for the delay was simple. The old Puritan families who ran the state didn't want to share power. For decades, Connecticut had been operating under its original colonial charter, a document literally granted by a British king. They kept using a king's permission slip as their governing law, long after they declared that kings had no authority over them. The irony was not lost on everyone. Thomas Jefferson called it embarrassing. He was right. Then there is the case of Missouri, 1820, possibly the most nakedly cynical founding document in American history. Missouri applied for statehood in the middle of the fiercest national debate about slavery the country had yet seen. Congress was deadlocked. The North wanted limits. The South wanted expansion. Missouri's proposed constitution didn't just allow slavery. It required the legislature to pass laws preventing free black citizens from even entering the state. Free people, American citizens, banned from crossing a state line. There was outrage in the North, threats in the South, and weeks of gridlock. Henry Clay, the man they called the Great Compromiser, brokered a deal that admitted Missouri anyway, with a vague promise that the offensive clause would not be enforced. It was still in the Constitution. They just agreed to look the other way. That clause sat in Missouri's founding document for decades, a landmine waiting. And back in Philadelphia, the men who had once argued that all men are created equal were either dead, silent, or pretending not to notice. These were not oversights. They were choices, deliberate, calculated, and protected by the very laws meant to guarantee justice. But the most explosive secret wasn't buried in any of these constitutions. It was buried in the land itself, and it had been there long before any of these men ever picked up a pen. Every state had something to hide when the Civil War came, and most of them have never fully admitted it. Take Missouri, a state that officially stayed in the Union. But here's what they don't put on the welcome signs. Missouri had two governments during the Civil War, one loyal to the Union, one loyal to the Confederacy. Governor Claiborne Fox Jackson tried to pull Missouri out in 1861. He failed, but he didn't quit. He fled the capital, set up a rebel government in exile, and Missouri officially had two commanders-in-chief at the same time. Think about that for a second. The same state, two governments, two armies, neighbor killing neighbor. Over 1,000 separate armed engagements happened on Missouri soil. More than almost any other state in the entire war. And it was not clean, organized warfare. William Quantrill and his raiders burned the town of Lawrence, Kansas in August 1863. 150 civilians, most of them unarmed men and boys, killed in a single morning. Quantrill's men dragged them out of their homes before dawn. That kind of violence did not end when Lee surrendered at Appomattox. In Missouri, it kept going for years. Jesse James, yes, that Jesse James, got his start riding with Confederate guerrillas in Missouri during the war. The war taught him that the law was something you survived, not something you obeyed. Now go further south, to a state that most people forget was even in the Confederacy. Tennessee was divided almost perfectly in half, not just politically but geographically. East Tennessee was full of Unionists who hated secession so much that some counties tried to secede from Tennessee itself. They sent a petition to the state government begging to stay in the United States. The Confederate government in Nashville said no, and then sent troops to suppress them. Confederate soldiers occupying East Tennessee imprisoned, hanged, and exiled their own neighbors for loyalty to the Union. One man named William Parson Brownlow, a newspaper editor in Knoxville, refused to stop printing anti-Confederate editorials even after troops arrived. They arrested him, imprisoned him, and eventually expelled him from the Confederacy. He walked across enemy lines into Union territory and kept writing. He became the most famous Unionist voice in the entire South. Tennessee was not one thing. It never was. Now let's talk about a state that surprises almost everyone. Delaware, tiny, sitting right next to the Mason-Dixon line, never left the Union. But Delaware also never abolished slavery during the war. Even after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, Delaware was exempt. The proclamation only freed enslaved people in Confederate states, and Delaware was not one of them. Delaware did not ratify the 13th Amendment, the one that actually abolished slavery everywhere, until 1899. Slavery had been illegal in the entire country for 36 years before Delaware officially said it agreed. They didn't do it symbolically until 2003. Let that land. And then there's West Virginia, a state that was literally born from the Civil War. The western counties of Virginia refused to secede when Richmond did, so they broke off. They held their own conventions, wrote their own constitution, and asked Congress to admit them as a brand new state. Abraham Lincoln signed West Virginia into statehood on June 20th, 1863, in the middle of the war. A state born in rebellion against a rebellion. The Confederacy called it illegal, the Union called it necessary. Constitutional scholars are still arguing about whether it was either. Every one of these states carries a scar that the official history books barely mention. Secrets written not in ink, but in blood, in silence, and in laws that took over a century to change. But the secrets buried inside the state's own borders, those run even deeper than the war itself. The dust hadn't even settled on the Civil War when the real scramble began. Not a scramble for freedom or dignity, a scramble for land. Millions of acres, billions of dollars, and the men who grabbed it didn't fight a single battle to get it. Here's where it gets ugly. Between 1870 and 1900, the federal government handed out more land than the entire size of Texas, twice over. Not to farmers, not to veterans, to railroads. The Pacific Railway Acts gave the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads something almost incomprehensible. For every mile of track they laid, they received 10 square miles of public land on either side. 10 square miles per mile of track. Do the math and it stops feeling real. By 1871, American railroad companies controlled over 170 million acres of land that had belonged to everyone, or more accurately, to the people who had lived on it for centuries, but nobody was calling it theft. They were calling it progress. And at the center of this machine was one man who understood power better than almost anyone alive, Jay Gould. He was 5'6", weighed barely 120 pounds, and by 1880, he controlled more railroad track than any person on earth. He didn't build anything. He bought things, broke them, and sold the pieces for profit. In 1869, he nearly cornered the entire gold market of the United States in a scheme so brazen it triggered a national financial panic. That event, Black Friday, September 24, 1869, wiped out thousands of ordinary Americans in a single afternoon. Gould walked away richer. But gold was only one piece of the machine. The real story of the Gilded Age land grabs isn't one villain. It's a system so perfectly designed to take that it barely needed villains at all. Take what happened in California. After the Mexican-American War, old Spanish land grants were supposed to be honored under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Supposed to be. Instead, the Land Act of 1851 forced every Mexican landholder to prove their claim before a federal commission. In English, in American courts, with American lawyers. Most couldn't afford the legal fight. Cases dragged on for 15, 20 years. Families who had farmed the same land for generations watched it legally dissolve from underneath their feet. By the time the courts finished, vast stretches of Southern California had transferred quietly into the hands of Anglo settlers and railroad speculators. And then there was Oklahoma. For decades, the federal government had designated the center of modern-day Oklahoma as unassigned lands, territory it had taken from the 5 civilized tribes, but hadn't yet given to anyone. That changed on April 22, 1889. A gunshot fired. 50,000 people on horses, in wagons, on bicycles and on foot, all surged forward at once, across a flat red plain, to claim pieces of land the government was simply giving away. 2 million acres, claimed in a single afternoon. It was called the Land Run of 1889, and newspapers celebrated it as one of the most uniquely American events in history. What those newspapers didn't mention was that some settlers had sneaked across the border the night before to stake the best claims. Those cheaters became known as Sooners. Today that word is a mascot, a football team, a point of pride. History has a way of softening its own edges. But perhaps no land grab of the Gilded Age was more coldly systematic than what happened in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. The Timber and Stone Act of 1878 allowed any citizen to purchase 160 acres of federal timberland for $2.50 an acre. Timber companies hired men off ships in San Francisco, marched them to land offices, had them sign the paperwork, and immediately transferred the deeds. Hundreds of thousands of acres of ancient forest gone, in a process that was completely legal and completely corrupt at the same time. By 1900, private timber interests controlled forests larger than some eastern states. The government knew, Congress knew, and for decades almost nothing was done, because the men doing the taking were the same men writing the laws. This was the Gilded Age, glittering on the surface, rotten underneath, and absolutely determined to consume every acre it could reach before anyone thought to stop it. And just when it seemed like no one could challenge the machine, one man decided he would. The 20th century didn't just change America, it buried parts of it. And some of those buried parts are only now clawing their way back to the surface. Let's start in 1921, in a city most Americans couldn't place on a map, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Greenwood District, they called it Black Wall Street. It was 35 blocks of black-owned banks, hotels, law offices, and theaters, one of the wealthiest black communities in the entire country. Then, on the night of May 31, 1921, white mobs armed with rifles and torches moved in. Some accounts say planes circled overhead, dropping incendiary devices on the neighborhood below. By morning, over 35 blocks were ash. At least 300 people were dead. Some historians say far more. 10,000 black residents were left homeless overnight. And then the cover-up began. City officials suppressed the death records. The state didn't formally investigate for 75 years. School textbooks in Oklahoma didn't mention it for decades. An entire massacre, erased from the official story of America. But Tulsa wasn't alone. Rosewood, Florida, 1923. Another thriving black town burned to the ground by a white mob over the course of a week. The state of Florida paid no reparations until 1994. 71 years of official silence. Now move the clock forward. 1932. The United States government launched a medical study in Macon County, Alabama. They told 400 black men they were being treated for bad blood. They were not being treated at all. Government doctors were watching syphilis destroy their bodies on purpose to study the disease's progression. They were given fake pills. When penicillin became widely available in 1947, a known cure, the men were not told. The study ran until 1972. A whistleblower named Peter Buxton leaked the story to the press, and the nation was stunned. By then, 28 men had died of syphilis, 100 of related complications, 40 wives infected, 19 children born with congenital syphilis. President Clinton formally apologized in 1997, 65 years after it started. Now jump to 1953. The Central Intelligence Agency launched a program called MK-Ultra. The goal? Develop mind control techniques using LSD, hypnosis, and psychological torture. They tested on prisoners, mental patients, and without consent, ordinary American citizens. One Army scientist named Frank Olson was dosed with LSD without his knowledge. 9 days later, he fell from a New York hotel window on the 13th floor. The government called it suicide. His family never believed it. When the documents were finally declassified in 1977, the Senate held hearings. CIA Director Richard Helms had already ordered thousands of MK-Ultra files destroyed in 1973. Whatever was in those files, we will never know. And that pattern, the secret, the cover-up, the slow reveal, runs through the whole century. The internment of Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor, authorized by Executive Order 9066. 120,000 people locked away, 2/3 of them American citizens. The government's own commission later called it a grave injustice. The Lavender Scare of the 1950s, when the State Department fired hundreds of employees simply for being gay. Senator Joseph McCarthy called them security risks. Many lost everything, careers, families, their entire lives, because of who they were. These weren't fringe events. These were official government policies, stamped, signed, and carried out in the open, and then quietly buried. The question that haunts every one of these stories is the same. How many more are still buried? Because if there's one thing the 20th century taught us, it's that the cover-up is always part of the plan. And the secrets of the past have a way of shaping the country we live in right now. But as dark as these cover-ups were, nothing could have prepared the country for what was already waiting just beneath the surface. Some secrets don't stay buried in history books. They stay buried under your feet. Right now, in every state in this country, there are things the official record never fully explained. Things that were covered up, forgotten, or simply never solved. And some of them are sitting in plain sight. Let's start in New Mexico. In 1947, something came down near Roswell. The military called it a weather balloon. They said it once, and then they said nothing more. But here's what they don't tell you in the textbooks. Dozens of local ranchers and residents gave sworn statements, describing debris unlike anything they had ever seen. Mac Brazel, the rancher who found it first, was held by the military for days. He came back to his neighbors a changed man. To this day, the full contents of what the Army retrieved from that field have never been publicly released. And Roswell is not even the strangest thing New Mexico is hiding. Dulce, a tiny town on the Colorado border, sits above what some researchers call an underground government facility. No one has ever confirmed it. No one has ever fully denied it either. Move east to Georgia. In 1980, a mysterious granite monument was erected in Elbert County. It was commissioned by an anonymous man using a fake name. Robert C. Christian, that's what he called himself. The stones laid out 10 guidelines for humanity, written in 8 languages including Sanskrit and Babylonian. The man who paid for them was never identified. The guidestones were demolished in 2022 after an explosion, and the ruins were immediately cleared by the state. Within hours, the evidence was gone. Who built them and why remains completely unknown. Now go north to Alaska. House Majority Leader Hale Boggs boarded a small plane from Anchorage. The plane disappeared over the Alaskan wilderness. No wreckage was ever found. No bodies, no black box, no explanation. The search involved the largest air rescue operation in Alaskan history at that time. 40 planes scoured over 32,000 square miles of terrain. Nothing. Boggs had been one of the members of the Warren Commission, the panel that investigated JFK's assassination. He had publicly questioned its findings before he disappeared. He never got to say more. Let's go to Louisiana. In the 1980s, a series of murders along I-10 went unsolved for nearly 20 years. When Derek Todd Lee was finally caught in 2003, investigators discovered that DNA evidence had existed for years, evidence that could have stopped him much earlier. Why it wasn't processed, why cases weren't connected, those answers were never fully given to the victims' families. Now look at what's happening in Utah today. Beneath the red rock of San Juan County sit some of the most significant untouched Native American archaeological sites in North America. For decades, looting was rampant. In 2009, the FBI ran the largest archaeological sting in U.S. history. Dozens of collectors were arrested, but the artifacts themselves, thousands of items, were never all recovered. They are scattered in private collections across the country, pieces of history that belong to nobody now, and to everybody who lost them. Here's the thing about America. Every single state has a version of this story, a gap in the record, a question nobody in power wanted answered, a name that got buried. The country was built on bold ambitions and brilliant people, but also on the decision, made again and again, to look the other way. And the truly unsettling part is not that these secrets exist, it's that most of them are still out there, unresolved, unacknowledged, waiting. America's secrets did not die with the century that made them, and some of the most important truths about who we are have never once been spoken aloud.